Peace, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is the first installment of the 2026 Streets of the Statehouse podcast. So I want to welcome everybody who's made a decision to come in and be with us for a little while this evening. The purpose of this podcast is to provide those that are interested in our work in the Maryland General Assembly, which actually starts tomorrow. So our state legislature is in session for 90 days in Maryland. And so tomorrow is the first day of our legislative session. And so, again, the purpose of this podcast is to provide those that are interested in our work and insight into the nature of our work in the state legislature. And so that's the particular focus of this podcast. For those who are not familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're a grassroots think tank and political advocacy organization. We are unapologetically revolutionary Pan-African nationalists. And that means a lot of things, but most relevant to this conversation, what that means is that we're clear that in a society structured on racism and white supremacy, that if Black people are going to have power, if we're going to have liberation, then we need to engage the political landscape from the vantage point of understanding that it's a site for contestation for power and resources. So we're not of the school of thought that politics is the kind of fairy tale after school special, just get involved and have your voice heard. We're clear that that is a fiction of white supremacist political imagination, that the reality is that which runs the government and the policies that govern our lives is, again, the white supremacist establishment and an ecosystem of institutions that want to maintain the existing power arrangement where Black people are subordinate to the larger forces in our society. So that is our general analysis. And that's big. And one of the places that I want to start before I talk specifically about the kind of upcoming legislative session, some of the political dynamics, is I want to say a little bit about what I think is the significance of LBS in the legislative and political landscape. Because one of the things that I'm extremely proud of is the fact that as an organization that is explicitly committed to Black liberation, explicitly challenges the nature of racism and white supremacy, how it shows up, we're the biggest critics of both major parties in terms of the ways that they perpetuate racism and white supremacy and the unique ways that each of those parties do that. But we're really clear with an analysis such as ours that it is usually not the case that folks that carry our perspective are of significant influence in the formal electoral policy landscape. And one of the things I'm extremely proud of is that LBS is at a place where we are a significant force in the political landscape and can do so without having to moderate ourselves, to know white folks that veto power over the nature of the things we say or do. And so that's a really important thing for the state of Maryland, for Black people, is that we're really clear that if we're going to be effective, what makes us effective is the fact that we have a strong base of support, primarily amongst our community. And that shows up whether you're a person who's one of the thousands of people that's in our mailing list, one of the thousands of people that follow us on social media, one of the hundreds of people that contribute to us monthly that allows us to retain our independence and being able to be unapologetic in our advocacy, that there are a range of ways that we're able to weaponize the strong support we have in our community, our base, and weaponize that in order to make it hurt for those that are in the political establishment to not deliver on policies that are important and necessary for our community. So I wanted to start with that perspective, just so you have a sense of why it is that we thought that it was particularly important for us to have a podcast specifically to talk about the Maryland General Assembly and to give you a sense of the uniqueness of our analysis of the political landscape in a way that differs from even some of our progressive friends and their analysis of the legislative landscape in the state capital in Annapolis. So as I mentioned, tomorrow is the first day of the Maryland General Assembly. Again, it's a 90-day session. And what I'll do later on is I'll talk specifically about some of our LBS's particular legislative priorities. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about just some of the dynamics that I think are going to be at play in the Maryland General Assembly that I think that cuts across a variety of different issue areas. Right, so I'm going to start with just a general sense of that before getting specifically to our legislative agenda. So I want to actually pick up a little bit where I started in terms of the landscape of Annapolis. And there are a few things to extend on where I started. So I would say the first thing is that, as an organization with an explicitly and unapologetic revolutionary Black political lens, that one of the things that we're clear about is that there are certain narratives that are often put out there in mainstream media in order to impact policy. And one of the things that at this point folks know and familiar with our work know about our criticisms of Sinclair Broadcasting, David Smith, who's the executive chairman, and some elements of WBAL radio that in some ways uses some of the same rhetoric and even some of the same so-called experts to opine on certain issues. I raised that at the top of this conversation because one of the things that we've been saying for years is that one of the impacts of Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith and the increased attention that they are paying over the past few years to the Maryland General Assembly is that they are, at this point, a right-wing advocacy organization masquerading as a media company. And it's really important for us to have that perspective. A few years ago, in the 2024 Maryland General Assembly, there was a bill that appeared that was sponsored by all of the Democratic leadership. So both the governor, both the then speaker, and the Senate president sponsored a bill that in essence reversed the progress that has been made on juvenile justice. So one of the things that those that are engaged in the work know that, Black youth are two and a half times more likely to be incarcerated, overrepresented in the criminal justice system, are over incarcerated. There's so many young people who are, and one of the things you're going to hear me talk about later is stopping the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. 85% of the young people that are charged as adults are Black youth, right? So overrepresented their population in the state of Maryland, and experience longer sentences and all. And I'll get to the specifics of that later. But one of the things that folks have been doing. We worked, for instance, years ago in collaboration with a variety of different organizations on the Child Interrogation Protection Act, which for us was a simple piece of legislation that required that if a young person is engaged in a custodial interrogation of a law enforcement officer, that a parent is notified and that they get to consult an attorney before the interrogation. Really simple. But this was an example of the kind of legislation that prosecutors around the state, led by the Maryland State's Attorneys Association, so folks like Scott Schellenberger, who's the state's attorney in Baltimore County, the Howard County State's Attorney, Rich Gibson. So they're, McCarthy in Montgomery County. So there are a range of, prosecutors and other law enforcement establishment that have been pushing back, and the echo chamber or the megaphone for those forces has been Sinclair Broadcasting. So much of the work that LBS has been doing over the past several years in the Maryland General Assembly is impacted by the media ecosystem and landscape, and Sinclair Broadcasting in particular. And I mentioned that 2024 bill because that bill, in essence, when I talk to elected officials off the record, many of them would say that they don't even think that bill did very much, right? Because we were saying that they should not pass the bill, because what that bill did was that it expanded the jurisdiction of the Department of Juvenile Services, expanded the offenses that they were automatically given jurisdiction. What we know is that we want as many opportunities to divert young people from the system as much as possible. So if you have, whether it's a law enforcement officer or a counselor or a caring adult who encounters a young person, right, that is alleged to have engaged in some kind of criminal activity, we want the ability for that person to be able to make an assessment as to whether or not this young person in this circumstance is best served by being in the system. And so what that bill did was it shrunk the ability to have that kind of case-by-case discretion to ensure that young people were not being incarcerated that would be better served outside of incarceration. And so the fact that the legislature passed that bill right in 2024, and this is something I commented on at the time, the purpose of that bill was really to appease Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith. And if you watch the coverage of Sinclair Broadcasting and Fox 45 of that bill, they're covering it as if it's a bill that they're working. Like, it actually reads the way that a person who's working on legislation, they followed that piece of legislation as if it was something that they had put in and were an advocacy group supporting. So I'm saying that because that has significantly impacted the legislative landscape. And it's going to be important that we continue to be vigilant about the ways that their news coverage is being weaponized as a mechanism to try to advance a right-wing agenda that primarily is about criminalizing Black people, right? So making it so that the criminal justice system is the primary intervention when it comes to our community as opposed to the last resort. Because we live in a society of racism and white supremacy, so Black people are seen as inherently prone to criminality. And so that is something that drives the kind of right-wing conservative thrust in terms of policymaking in the Maryland General Assembly. So that's going to be an important force to be clear about, that is hovering over the political activity that people will be engaged in during the Maryland General Assembly. So wanted to provide just that bit of context about the landscape that we are navigating. Which you will also see is that even though LBS is a significant force in the legislative landscape, you will still see elements of mainstream media avoid covering our engagement. And part of the rationale as to why I think that happens is because I think the right wing, particularly Sinclair in this case, avoids actually directly confronting us in terms of making our case, because they know that if we actually have to debate them on the issues, right, that they aren't capable of being able to advance their perspective in a direct conversation with folks who can make the best version of the arguments on our side of the issues in terms of addressing the way that the criminal juvenile justice system is weaponized against our community and harms our people. So that's really important context in terms of the dynamics that we're going to be dealing with during this Maryland General Assembly. One example of this that I want to give, and these aren't bills that we're working on, but bills that we're going to oppose. So Sinclair Broadcasting has collaborated directly with Delegate Matt Morgan, who's a Republican, and Delegate Kathleen Schlager, who's also a Republican. And they've put in pieces of legislation that are based in baseless attacks. And I wrote about this a couple of times. I wrote about this in reference to the letter that the State's Attorney Ivan Bates sent to the Mayor Brandon Scott about his lack of interest and willingness to work with Monsi. So I wrote something that was in reference to that, and then I wrote something more recently on Substack that talked more specifically about the attack against Black-led grassroots organizations. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit in connection to these pieces of legislation that the delegates that I just mentioned have put in conjunction with backing from Sinclair Broadcasting. So they put in pieces of legislation that range from, if you are a nonprofit organization, because you see the faulty reporting on the kind of spotlight on Maryland nonsense that you see coming out of Sinclair Broadcasting, where they see themselves as investigating corruption and waste. What they are actually doing is that they're actually creating propaganda to justify not investing in Black-led grassroots organizations to address the issues that face our community. You think about like the human service industry in general, whether it's education, public health, social work, reentry. Many of these are areas that the majority of those that are being served are our community. But what has traditionally happened, and part of LBS's advocacy over the years, is that white folks usually dominate the major institutions that are providing services to our community. They're not effective, and they're hustling off of our suffering. So the investment in Black-led grassroots organizations is about economic redistribution to those communities most directly impacted by these systems of oppression, such that we can build the institutional wherewithal to solve our own problems. We see that with the reductions in non-fatal shootings and homicides in Baltimore, where from our perspective, while there are a variety of those who played an important role in making sure in the accomplishment of reducing the number of homicides in Baltimore City, we see that primarily those that are boots on the ground or community-based violence prevention work. A lot of those folks are people that are formerly incarcerated, people that work with the population of folks that are formerly incarcerated, a network of folks that have been working tirelessly to address themselves to the issue of violence in our community. And so when I describe the war on Black-led grassroots organizations, I'm talking about Sinclair Broadcasting's constant media propaganda to cast dispersion on these organizations, making it appear that there's some impropriety in investing in those organizations to do their work. You can disagree with the particular organizations or whether you think it makes sense to fund them, or whether you think their approach is correct. But these are decisions that are made that are not about people being engaged in criminal activity, right? People can disagree about investments that are made and whether organizations are effective. What you don't see in Sinclair Broadcasting coverage is an in-depth, substantive analysis of the actual work that these organizations do. It's clearly a bunch of gotcha attempts to cast aspersion on these organizations, to make them look bad, so that ultimately more of those public resources go to law enforcement and law enforcement adjacent forces in order to address public safety. So all of that is stuff that I wrote about on my Substack about the war against Black-led grassroots organizations that is relevant to this coming Maryland General Assembly, because the pieces of legislation that I started to mention, where if you're a nonprofit that receives at least $50,000 from the government, then it adds additional reporting requirements. It makes you subject to additional public disclosure. So similar to government agencies that are required to, if a request is made, to disclose public information, it makes it so that nonprofits are bound by those same regulations. And what it does is that if you're not in good standing, you're not eligible to receive funding to be invested in by government funding, public dollars. So those are the kinds of pieces of legislation that are targeted at smaller grassroots organizations that don't have the infrastructure sometimes to keep up with all the administrative burden. Because anyone who's received public dollars knows that it's not people not just handing out bags of money, but there are lots of requirements and stipulations. There's so much compliance that is involved in grant agreements and contracts. So and all of these things are publicly available. And many of the people that are engaged in this work you can talk to directly, right? These are people that you can have a conversation. You can go see their work. I was at a walk a few days ago in East Baltimore with Uncle T from Challenge to Change, the folks at Baltimore Peace Movement, and there were a variety of folks there, like lots of folks there during this peace walk, in East Baltimore on a Friday evening. I don't see many of the folks that have these criticisms of these nonprofits they feel like are receiving all this money, and the language and verbiage that Sinclair uses of cloak of secrecy just show up, and you can see the work that folks are actually engaged in doing. So the legislation that I just mentioned, there are 3 bills that do different pieces of what I described. We're going to oppose those pieces of legislation. I wanted to talk about that at the top, just to give an example as to how Sinclair Broadcasting is positioning itself as an advocacy organization, but masquerading as a media organization. Because if you watch the story that they do, on the piece of legislation I just mentioned, it's in conjunction with their previous reporting about the so-called lack of transparency in nonprofits that receive public dollars. So again, it's just important to have that context as to how that impacts the nature of the policy-making arena. You should expect that, and I'll talk about this when I get to the specifics, you should expect that there will be coverage. There already is coverage on one of our major priorities. We are working to stop the automatic charging of youth as adults. Again, I'll get to that later on. But you should just expect that those things, the nature of the conversations on Sinclair Media will have an impact on how those policies are understood and the advocacy on them. All right, so a couple of other things that I want to address before I get specifically to our legislative agenda. One of the things that happened over the past month is that the former Speaker, Adrienne Jones, stepped down from her post, and Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, who was formerly the chair of the Health and Government Operations Committee, has been elevated to Speaker of the House. And one of the things that I think is important for our audience to know is that our assessment of some of the leadership shifts that have been made in the House since the new Speaker has had the gavel seem to indicate empowering legislators that are more progressive. And this is something that in many respects is great news for much of the issues that we work on, right? Many of the issues that we work on, I believe, are more viable as a result of the changes that have been made in House leadership by the new speaker. So that's something that I think is important for people to know, for people to have a sense of. So I want to talk briefly about this concept, just in terms of how we navigate the political landscape and how that matches with the larger kind of revolutionary political worldview that we have. So we're always clear that we're clear that America's a settler colony. We're clear that Black people are going to get free based off of sovereign political militant activity, where we can practice self-determination and where we are wielders of power that are able to effectively contest for power, as I said in the beginning. That's our perspective. We are clear that Maryland is a Democratic Party stronghold. We're clear that political leadership in their policies are not revolutionaries. Even the ones we like, even people who are elected office that we like, that we think are good, that generally are good on many of our issues, these are not folks that I think would purport to have revolutionary politics, right? These aren't people that will purport, solidarity, with the BLA, or folks that would talk about, the militancy of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, or Marcus Garvey, or these are not folks with revolutionary political presence, right, in the political landscape. That's generally not. There are a few exceptions, but that is generally not who is sitting in the seats in elected office. But what we know is that folks can not have revolutionary politics, but can love Black people. So what we have learned how to do is to navigate the political landscape to retain our politics. So no one is confused about the nature of what we advocate for. No one's confused about what our political allegiances and worldview is as it relates to mainstream, those that are in the mainstream political landscape. But we also know that there are things that our community needs short and immediate term, that if we can try to influence that, right, then we can deliver. And what we've been doing for the past 16 years has been able to deliver concretely for Black people in our community. What has happened, as I mentioned, with the changes in the House, that what has happened is that I think now, as I mentioned, more of the things that we work on, more of the things that are our priorities, I think are more politically viable now, right? Given the fact that we have a new speaker. And one of the things that you will hear Republicans say about Maryland and about Democrats, they'll say that the Democrats have taken the state legislature and gone way left. It's important for our viewers to be clear that the guardrails around the political spectrum, that is Maryland and Maryland's political environment, that what they describe as going far left in reality is left of center, maybe liberal, in some cases progressive. But the Maryland Democratic Party itself is not a progressive left-wing party. And the policies that the Democratic Party pushes out the Maryland General Assembly are not radical leftist policies. You have some progressive policies, right? Many policies that we work on, one could put in the category as progressive, right? Meaning beyond liberal, but not revolutionary, not radical. And it's important, I think, for me to say that in this context, because even though, as I mentioned, I think this speaker and the leadership changes makes much of what we would advocate for more viable, that doesn't make those who may sponsor some of our piece of legislation, or those that may vote for our piece of legislation, it doesn't make them revolutionary. And the work that the long-term work that we're trying to do is to push, right, the larger polity, right, to push the political ecosystem to be more radical, because our society is structured on racism and white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, other forms of domination and oppression. So we need to have politics that are radical responses to the radical injustice and dehumanization that constitutes the core of this society. So I'm saying that so that we calibrate our understanding that even though our stuff may be more viable, given some of the leadership changes, that doesn't necessarily correlate to a more revolutionary legislature. but we're going to push them as much as we can in that direction in order to be able to deliver for folks in our community. So that's one thing, a reflection on the nature of the changes in the House that I think are important context. A couple of other things before I get specifically to our legislative agenda. So one of the things that's important to note, so I talked about the Speaker of the House. The Senate President has a challenger, right? So first time in a long time that Senate President Bill Ferguson has had a challenger. His challenger, in terms of the rhetoric and what is out there in public, describes himself as a Bernie Democrat and seems to be running on a platform that is more progressive than the current Senate President. One of the things that I want to, so there are a couple of things I think are important to say about that. The first is it's important that we're clear that that serves as leverage, right, in order to try to get as many things through as possible, right? That is so even if Bobby Le Pen, I believe is his name, even if he doesn't win, right, it helps running to his left, running to Ferguson's left. It is helpful in terms of putting pressure to move important pieces of legislation. Now, with that being said, it's a person I don't know very much about. This person I'm saying, Ferguson's challenger, it's a person I don't know very much about. I don't have any sense of his track record on any of the major issues that folks would consider progressive. I know on issues that LBS has worked on, he hasn't had a presence in any of the spaces that we've worked in. So I think the question as to the authenticity of his politics, I think, are things that are important to question, even for those of us that are left of Ferguson. It's important that we ask important questions as to the sincerity and legitimacy of the perspectives that are offered by Ferguson's challenger. But I think that's something that will be important for people to know and to pay attention to, and to observe how that might impact the legislature. And then lastly, before I get to our particular legislative agenda, is the impact. So one of the things that many folks are familiar with now that we worked on was a bill to study reparations in Maryland, both studying the harms of chattel slavery, racialized oppression, Jim Crow, but more importantly, to study how to implement a series of reparations policies. And so, I'm sure a lot of people who've been paying attention, the governor vetoed it. And to the credit of the Legislative Black Caucus and the legislature in general, those vetoes were overwritten. And I mention that because one of the dynamics that there's been some reporting on, but that I have some kind of firsthand knowledge of, is that there is some interesting tension between the governor and the legislature. And there are two things that I want to say about that that's relevant to the stuff that we're going to talk about. The first is that while the governor maintains that he is not running for president, there are folks within the Democratic Party establishment nationally that are pushing him to, that want him to. I know that he's been in places and taken meetings with folks that usually indicate a person is running for president, potentially thinking about running for president. And that matters because then what that does is that some of the decision making that is made by the governor's office, whether they would admit it or not, is impacted by national politics, right? That the flows of national politics will have an even greater microphone in Maryland because of the speculation of the governor being interested in a future presidential run. So, and to be honest, that dynamic has actually been quite an annoying aspect of doing legislative advocacy, because it adds an additional layer of things that are part of the decision-making calculus that don't have much to do with the policy itself. And I'm not saying that this is the case for all the things that the governor does, but I'm just saying that it is a dynamic that plays a role. And so it just adds an additional dynamic in terms of navigating the political space that doesn't have much to do with the people, but more to do with those kind of political opportunities. The other thing that I think is important why that matters is because it is my sense that the governor's political track record, he is crafting a track record as a moderate Democrat with progressive rhetoric, but in terms of actual policies that are moderate. And I think that the base of the Democratic Party is interested in going more to the left, right? That's our observation, that's our perspective. That the base of the party, which is largely black and brown, who are folks that want policies that more directly address our conditions. So it makes sense that policies that are more progressive, more leftist, more radical are going to be the kinds of policies that you would get from the base of the Democratic Party. And so I think this also presents a potential additional layer of conflict and friction, because the base of the party wants to go one direction. And I think many of the legislators are being pressured by organizations like mine and many others to go in that direction, while the governor, I think, is governing from a kind of, again, progressive rhetoric, but in terms of actual track record, running as a moderate. And I think that, again, so that is just a dynamic that I think is going to play a role in how some of the items, both the major items that are going to be discussed in the Maryland General Assembly and some of our specific legislative items. So that's just some of the context that I want to give. All right, so I'm going to take the rest of the time to talk about our specific legislative priorities, just so you all get a sense of like the primary things that we're working on. We'll also be paying attention to just other important issues and weighing in places where we can be impactful. So those are things you'll see in future episodes. But again, let me address LBS's legislative agenda. So first, as I mentioned previously, one of the major items on our legislative agenda is stopping the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. There are over 30 charges in Maryland that if a young person is charged with it, they're automatically in the adult prison system. And and there are a variety of challenges with that. One, you have youth in adult prison facilities. When they're in adult prison facilities, they're not entitled to mental health services. They're not entitled to go to school. Whereas in the juvenile system, they are given those interventions, those services. Additionally, it's just dehumanizing for a young person to be in an adult facility with adults, with grown people, right? And there are conditions within those adult prison facilities that are just harmful to that young person's development. And I know people who've had young folks who've been in the adult prison system, of which in some cases irreparable harm has been done to the psyche of those young people. In 2024, there were 529 young people that were charged as adults that were way back down. So this is another dynamic, that 85% of the young people who are charged as adults either have their cases dismissed or are way back down to the juvenile system. So you have young people, many of which spending time in the adult prison facilities, when a judge determines that the majority of them don't belong there anyway. So this is a practice that Maryland is the second worst in the country as it relates to this practice, second to Alabama. And so Maryland touts itself as such a progressive place, but they have such an arcane practice that is so dehumanizing. 80% of these young people are charged as adults are Black. And so you think about the kind of violence. And one of the things that in discussions that I've had publicly about this, people on the other side will say things like, well, what about the victims of violent crime or just crime in general? And one of the things that we say is, while they are victims, the young people that are automatically charged as adults, especially those young people who are charged as adults that get waved back down, that those are victims too. That those young people are victims of a system that does not recognize their fundamental humanity. So this is a policy that folks have been working on for a long time. I am hopeful, as I mentioned before, that given some of the leadership changes in the House, that this policy will be more viable to move to end the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. A couple of things I'll say a little bit more about the policy, just provide more context, is that an example of the kind of charge that automatically puts a young person in an adult prison facility, possession of a firearm, right? We know that there are lots of people that carry firearms that aren't carrying them for the purpose of wanting to harm someone, but carry them for self-defense. And not that we're condoning young people carrying firearms, but it is a rational decision for a young person, particularly in neighborhoods where they know other people have them, especially in neighborhoods where they know or their experience is that law enforcement isn't interested in protecting them, right? So they're going to take matters into their own hands. So knowing that it is a rational choice to have dozens of young people who are charged with merely just possession of a firearm without the opportunity to make an assessment as to whether or not this young person's actually a menace to their community, or whether or not they're just carrying it for protection. And when I talk to people that directly work with this population, many of them say that that is the experience they have. So that's one thing that I think is going to be important. And what the opposition will use, the opposition will talk about and use isolated examples of extreme instances of violence that young people have committed in order to justify this policy. What they're in fact saying is that because this individual, heinous incidents of violence was committed by a young person, then all these young people need to be punished by subjecting them to the adult prison system, right, as a result of what this one individual heinous act done that was perpetrated. So that's just important to understand what the opposition is going to use to try to justify pushing back against this policy. So that's one of the major pieces of legislation that we'll be working on this coming legislative session. We're hoping that this will be a legislative Black Caucus priority. It was a legislative Black Caucus priority last session. So our hope is that it'll be a legislative Black Caucus priority this coming session. And I think given the changes in the House, I think it makes this policy more viable. Two, we're working on, we talked about reparations. One of the things that I've said as a person who is a recipient of mentorship by the reparations movement, right, by the radical Black nationalists and Pan-African nationalists who've been the core of the reparations movement. So many of the people who train me are folks that come out of that political and intellectual genealogy. But I would say there are two things that I think they were the weakest on that we are attempting to try to address. And that is the question of how much money and how do you determine where the resources go. We're going to be putting in a piece of legislation that would tax endowments above $1 billion. So these are foundations or nonprofit entities, C3 status, that have endowments where what they usually do is, you have a major endowment, then the interest that is accrued on those endowments then become cash that those institutions can use however they like. So you think about institutions like Johns Hopkins, right, which has, I believe, like a $16 billion endowment. So the interest that they accrue on that endowment, they're able to spend however they like. And if you're familiar with the history of Johns Hopkins being a slave owner, you think about the way that Johns Hopkins has benefited so much from all the study that is done on Black people, the billions of dollars in research. You think about the story of Henrietta Lacks and the immortal cells of Henrietta Lacks have been the basis for many of the kind of medical and scientific experimentation that has benefited the institution. There are a range of ways that Johns Hopkins as an institution has benefited, right, from racial oppression and white supremacy. So it is our perspective that one way, and so part of why we're putting this bill in lieu of the override of the study bill, is to provide the legislature with some conversation about what could it look like to institute reparations policies, particularly as it relates to private institutions, because that is truly something that needs to be studied. And that is something that people should become familiar with. It's the policy of taxing endowments of major institutions that we know have benefited from chattel slavery, white supremacy, Jim Crow, et cetera. So the purpose and we don't expect that this particular legislative item will pass, but we think it'll be an important conversation for legislators to have to begin thinking about concretely, what would it look like to actually carry out a reparations policy? So that is the second item that's on our agenda. Third item is one of the efforts that we helped to support the last couple of sessions was the Maryland Second Look Act, in conjunction with the Maryland Second Look Coalition, the ACLU of Maryland, with a variety of different organizations, leadership of Delegate Cheryl Pastor, who carried it in the House, Charles Sidnor in the Senate. And so one of the things that, and so that bill passed, and what that bill did, it was allow for people who serve more than 20 years the ability to have a judge assess their sentence to see whether or not they should be eligible for a reduction, with the thinking being that, Black men's sentences are 30% longer than white men for the same convictions. So we know that there's racial disparities, racial inequality in the sentencing that is done. And so the purpose of this piece of legislation is to provide that it excludes some things like life without parole and some of the carve-outs that will be important to come back and address, to expand it to include those. But I'm mentioning it because a piece of legislation, we're clear that because of that and other efforts that are taking place, that there are going to be more people coming home from incarceration. And we work directly with many organizations who are led by formerly incarcerated folks who are best suited to help support folks transition from inside to outside the walls. Many people that we're connected to are people who've come out of prison and have been extremely impactful in addressing homicide and violence in our community, right? So we see a direct connection between Second Look acts to get more people who've spent significant time behind the walls outside the walls, to provide opportunities to have their sentences reduced in order for many of those folks to participate. And I actually remember being on panels where people have come up to me afterwards and have said, hey, I just came home. I want to help address the violence. Who should I talk to, right? Who should I be engaged with to be a part of that, right? So that is something that I see an explicit connection. And so with the bill that we're going to be working on with Delegate Pastor, instead of the Sidnor, will be to require that Department of Corrections partners with those organizations led by folks who are formerly incarcerated, such that they can have access to folks who are incarcerated behind the walls to help prep them for coming out. And it's our understanding that there are examples of similar programming that the Department of Corrections currently does. That's something that we're going to work through during the Maryland General Assembly. It is our perspective that this is something that should be codified. It should be codified. The state be required to partner with organizations led by those that are formerly incarcerated, because it is those organizations and those individuals that are best suited to help those who are behind the walls, best suited to help them be able to transition once they come out of prison. So that is the third item. And then the last item on our legislative agenda is a bill sponsored by Delegate Gary Simmons, a bill that conditions funding, state funding, to public entities that host general election debates for statewide races. So folks who are familiar with LBS know that we've been critical of the Democratic Party. One of the things that we've advocated for is more political representation, right? That in essence, Maryland is a state that, save, the 2 terms of Larry Hogan, has been a Democratic Party stronghold. And being such, it creates a dynamic where politically perspectives to the left of the Democratic Party generally have been hard to be able to get traction. And it creates a dynamic where it's hard to hold the Democratic Party accountable. It's harder to hold them accountable when there isn't a viable alternative to the left. Now, we're clear that, the Green Party candidate, who, full disclosure, Andy Ellis is someone I've known since I was 18 years old, worked with him on many issues. He's a white dude who is, I would describe his perspective and worldview and knowledge, as at least radical, right? So progressive to radical, certainly to the left of the Democratic Party. And so we're clear that we don't expect that the Green Party candidate will win. What we know is that those who run for office pay attention to patterns, electoral patterns. And what we know is that if more people, even if Andy doesn't win, even the Green Party candidate doesn't win, that if they get a significant number, 10% would be huge. Because what it would do is it would indicate to those running for office that there are a significant amount of folks who are to the left of the Democratic Party. And that would incentivize them to govern, to advocate policies to the left of the Democratic Party. And we feel like we've seen that. I've written about that other places. I won't go too much into that. This bill would require everybody that appears on the ballot they have to participate. They have to be invited to participate in general election statewide races that are hosted by public entities affiliated with the state of Maryland. And that's significant because we think at the very least, because there are a variety of election reform policies that should be made, right? Things around public financing, things around encouraging more multi-party participation substantively. So there are a range of election reform policies in order to ensure more electoral representation of a variety of different perspectives. But all this bill does is require that, again, everybody on the ballot is invited to participate in the general election debate. That's important because, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of opportunities for people to hear the platforms of parties outside the two major parties, right? And if democracy is a serious commitment, which I'm clear it is not, democracy is not a serious commitment of those typically in power. But those who espouse a commitment to democracy, it's important for people to at least have the opportunity in a platform that'll be covered by media, a platform that are going to be watched by tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, especially with Wes Moore being someone who people speculate that there's presidential aspirations and at the very least is a national figure. To not have the opportunity to have him as I described earlier, a moderate Democrat challenged to their left, like people deserve to see what that could look like and deserve to see how the governor would respond to criticisms to his left. And that's not just about this current governor. That's just about the Democratic Party in general, having the requirement of at least having to respond in a public setting that is highly publicized to respond to criticisms to their left. So this debate for us is just the entree into even more election reform in order to ensure political representation. For us, this is a kind of a first step. Our hope is that this is a bill that can pass. Again, doesn't cost anything. Just invite additional candidates that appear on the ballot. So this isn't a free for all. So for all those who may say, well, if you make it open, then anybody can participate. Maryland has a very difficult process of what it takes to appear on the general election ballot. Ask our friends at Eugene People's Progress Party, right, who spent many years trying to work to get on the ballot, and just the thousands of signatures that it takes to be able to just even put in a petition to then create a party, to be in the Eugene People's Progress Party, Black worker-led party in Maryland, right? That's been doing work for a long time. We've collaborated with them in the past, but they don't have ballot access, right? So they wouldn't qualify to be on the stage. Those who would qualify, again, are just those who appear on the ballot. And so, again, it's important for people to have the opportunity to see different political perspectives represented in the political discourse. So that is our legislative agenda coming up. As I mentioned at the top, the Maryland General Assembly, the first day is tomorrow. You should expect that as we do Streets to the Statehouse during session, will be updates on piece of legislation that we're working on. And we're going to be observing other issues as well. So we're going to weigh in. I mentioned at the top some of the bills that the Republicans are putting in that we're going to oppose, because we want to make sure the Democrats don't even see any semblance to entertain those pieces of legislation. So we're going to be watching a variety of things. But as I just laid out what our central legislative agenda is, that's going to be where the majority of our focus, attention, and energy is. So last thing I'll say before I shut down for the night is to say that, to reiterate something I said at the top, is that to have an organization with our perspective being viable in the political landscape is something that it's important to be clear about. It's important to know that that is something that Maryland has, right? And that we've been able to push policy in ways that benefit the masses of our community. And so in order to do that, it's important to continue to support the work that we do. So one way to do that is to become a sustainer, right? So as I mentioned, there are, a few hundred people who give money to LBS monthly, and that helps us to be able to retain our independence, gives us more resources to do things like this. That helps us to be able to do the work that we need to do to let people know what's happening. And just a variety of things that it takes to do the work. And so if you can't be a sustainer, also sign up to be on our email listserv. Go to lbsbaltimore.com, sign up to get our newsletter, sign up to get our action alerts. It may seem like a small thing. As I mentioned at the top, LBS, we've been around for 16 years. We have a pretty strong track record of success in the legislative landscape. A huge part of that is the fact that our community, when we send out action alerts, when we say, hey, call or email these committee members, tell them to vote no on this or vote yes on that, those things actually make a much bigger difference than I think many people that may occur to them in the moment. And so if you can't be a sustainer, sign up to be on our listserv so that you can, contact your legislator in order to press them to support the perspectives that we've offered today. So if anything that, I've mentioned today are things that you're supportive of or things that you want to see advance, then again, please sign up to be on a listserv or become a sustainer to support our work. And then lastly, just if you don't want to do any of those, follow us on social media. That's another avenue where we keep people informed about the work that we're engaged in. So again, I'm Dayvon Love. I'm Director of Public Policy Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Our first installment of Streets of the Statehouse in 2026. We're going to be in Annapolis tomorrow to engage in the work of advocating unapologetically for Black people. And we appreciate all those that have supported us over the years and those that continue to support the work that we do here in Baltimore, here and around the state of Maryland. Have a good night. Peace. Safe travels.